Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. When you think of post-punk, what comes to mind? Maybe some other terms like new wave, no wave, new romantic, synth pop, hair metal, a lot of things. But to me, I think of the Cambrian explosion. Yeah, that's right, the Cambrian explosion. If you're up on your paleobiology, you'll know that the Cambrian explosion was the point in the Earth's ancient history, a half billion years ago, give or take, when animals went from being very simple to being a lot more complex. And it's described in this book, Wonderful Life, by Stephen Jay Gould. Previously, and I'm hugely paraphrasing here, animals mostly consisted of single cells and were pretty primitive by any standards. The explosion consisted of the relatively quick appearance of most of the major phyla that we know today. Scientists refer to it as a biological Big Bang. The interesting thing about it is that it led to animals with body types that we would consider strange today, if not downright alien, and they have no descendants in today's world. So to clarify, before we get into Lovecraft territory, a lot of these creatures were very small. They all lived in the water. We wouldn't really be frightened of them today. And the other thing is they didn't really have bones, so they left very few remains, and that makes you wonder how we ever found out about them in the first place. Well, fortunately, some of them were well preserved in these sedimentary deposits in places like the Burgess Shale in present-day British Columbia. The mud at these sites preserved all these soft body parts, and what we find there are all sorts of crazy-looking small animals. So, for instance, if I open this up here, we have Anomalocaris, who is the largest of these, actually a couple feet long, which is kind of freaky. It was a predator, and it had these shrimp-like mandibles and this sort of circular mouth, which is kind of strange. Another of them was Opabinia, and this is a really nutty one. It had 5 eyes and a mouth on the end of a tentacle. And just as a side note, I should point out that modern bees also have 5 eyes, and if you don't believe me, look it up. A bee has 2 large compound eyes, one on either side of its head, and it actually has 3 small simple eyes on the top of its head. So yeah, check that out. Today you learned. Any book on the Burgess Shale will give you a rundown of all this sort of animal weirdness. But my favorite is this thing that was so strange looking that scientists couldn't tell its head from its tail, and they named it hallucigenia since they couldn't even tell what they were looking at. In this book, they have this diagram of it, but it's actually reconstructed upside down here. So these days, scientists are pretty sure that the actual creature walked around like this, with tentacles on the bottom, crazy spikes on the top, and sort of a long tail hanging out the side. They were finally able to figure that out, and they decided that it's an early sort of what we would now call a velvet worm. Anyway, why do I think about the Cambrian explosion when I hear the term post-punk? Because much the same thing happened in the world of music in the late 70s. Punk rock showed the world that anyone could make music, and it democratized music, which is a point I'll get back to. But punk itself was just a starting point. It was a catalyst for a musical Big Bang. And once regular people got the message that they too could be musicians, the world of popular music exploded into a million small, weird genres. Much like the animals in the Burgess Shale, not all of these would survive into our modern world. But like the Cambrian explosion, the immediate post-punk period would demonstrate what was possible. It was a world in which the rules of music were being rewritten. And of course, there were those who would push experimental music into strange new directions, daring listeners to follow them. And then there were those who would codify punk into a formula in itself to be fossilized and endlessly copied. And there are always those who cash in and apply the old rules to the new music, essentially repackaging the old sounds into the new, right? So if we're going to take a microscope to this transition from punk to post-punk, we need to look no further than the archetypal punk band, the Sex Pistols, and look at how they fell apart and what came immediately after. And in some sense, that story acts as a summary or microcosm for how post-punk came to be. So let's talk about the Sex Pistols. Now, as an educated, intelligent, and no doubt attractive viewer, I'm sure you know all about the Sex Pistols, but for everyone else, let me just recap briefly. They formed in London in 1975. They took over the world in 1976. Everything about them challenged the status quo. So their dress, their language, their attitude, and to a lesser extent, their music. Their music was almost an afterthought, though, and in fact, it was pretty conventional in structure because it followed all of the so-called golden rules of pop. You know, intro, verse, chorus, verse, lead guitar, double chorus, outro. Be sure to read the manual by the KLF if you want an exhaustive breakdown of the golden rules. Anyway, it was really their attitude that fueled the punk movement, and they were sticking it to what was then popular in mid-70s music. You had your dinosaur prog rock like Yes and King Crimson, ELP and Wings, your stoner blues like Led Zeppelin and Cream, your schmaltz pop like Captain and Tennille and Linda Ronstadt and Steely Dan and the Carpenters, and of course your chicken fried southern rock like Leonard Skinner, the Allman Brothers, and the Eagles, man. And of course there were other bands and styles that were fighting against the adult-oriented radio of the day. Proto-metal bands like Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, art rock like David Bowie, early punk like Iggy and the Stooges. But all of these bands still involved real musicians. The Pistols were the first band to really demonstrate on a wide scale that you didn't have to know what you were doing to be a musician, and that was hugely consequential. The Pistols made this naked truth very clear in every show they played, because legions of punters would watch them and think, hell, I can do that. It was that impetus that fueled the post-punk movement. But, of course, the music transformed. Each person who got into music ended up putting their own spin on it, and few of them were satisfied to copy the Pistols themselves for long. And that's why it was like a musical Big Bang. And that analogy works if we just disregard all music before 1970, which frankly I'm prepared to do with very few exceptions. So I'm not going to recount their history here. If you want to know how they fell apart, you can read all about it on Wikipedia. And in some ways, their story is still playing out. But let's just say that their manager, who was a guy named Malcolm McLaren, made a misjudgment in thinking that the Pistols singer was someone who could be controlled. The singer was a guy named John Lydon, but who was known in the Pistols as Johnny Rotten. He proved that he was pretty clever, could think for himself, and had decided that he had had enough of Malcolm McLaren, so he quit the band in 1978. And to prove he was no puppet, he immediately formed another band, one of these seminal post-punk bands, with some of his friends. So guitarist Keith Levine and bassist John Wardle, known to his friends as Jaw Wobble. And they found a Canadian drummer, as you do, a fellow named Jim Walker. And Lydon named this new band Public Image Limited, or PIL. By definition, they were one of the first post-punk bands, since they formed immediately following the Sex Pistols. So let's talk about early PIL. Before I mention the albums here, I want to talk about how they wrote songs on these early albums. That's the really interesting bit for me. So as a band, they did a lot of improvisation. They had 4 people in the room. Someone would start playing and everyone else would follow along. And what came out of that process was kind of a function of the personalities that were involved. So you had Keith Levine. He was this very idiosyncratic guitarist. He was self-taught. He claims he learned how to play rock guitar in a single day. He had an unusual instrument. It was an all-aluminum Valino guitar that could be very trebly. These guitars are highly sought after these days. I saw one on eBay a year or so ago, and it was selling for thousands of dollars. Very cool guitar. But Keith Levine was also coming off a stint with a popular band. He was a founding member of The Clash. So he had some affinity for John Lydon's situation. John Wardle was just a friend of Lydon's who had some interest in learning how to play the bass, so he learned on the job. Dub reggae was big at the time. Wardle liked it, and it heavily influenced his bass playing. He played bass lines that were deep and repetitive and groovy. Jaw Wobble was his nickname, which was given to him by Sid Vicious. Sid said it was how Wardle mumbled his name when he was drunk. Then you had Jim Walker, who was one of many PIL drummers. They were much like Spinal Tap in that way. A drummer never hung around for too long, not at least until Bruce Smith, who's been playing with them now for a couple of decades. But that's getting way ahead of things. Jim Walker answered an ad to join the band, and he got hired. And I know Lydon still highly regards his playing, even though he left during the second album. The early PIL sound varied a lot. Their debut single was called Public Image, which is, of course, now an alternative rock staple, covered and revered by many, as it should be. It was a statement of intent. It was saying that we're going to be different from the Sex Pistols. And instead of angry punk, it was angry pop. It was almost catchy. It was something you might find your parents humming to. However, it was also something of an outlier, and it would be some time before they wrote another catchy song. Most of the songs on the first couple albums were written and recorded with, let's say, a bare minimum of planning. Most had Keith Levine's bright and almost brittle guitar, contrasted with Jaw Wobble's thick dub bass, and Jim Walker holding it all together with some solid drumming. And, of course, Lydon singing whatever he wanted to over the top, howling and rolling his R's and turning up the ends of every note like the musical equivalent of court jester's shoes. The first album, which I don't have here, was appropriately titled First Issue and featured Public Image as the single. And from what I heard and read, folks bought the album on the basis of that single, expecting a whole album of these angry pop gems, only to be baffled at the darker and more experimental or half-baked songs on the rest of the album. Kind of a bait and switch. The second album was more of the same, but it came in a cool metal box. And completely unencumbered by the thought process, they decided to name the album Metal Box. I do have this CD, but not in a metal box, unfortunately. It came out in the United States as second edition in fairly ordinary, boring packaging. I find all of this slightly confusing. You had first issue, second edition, metal box, and later there would be plastic box. But suffice to say, the packaging gimmick got everyone's attention. So did the fact that they pressed it on 4 vinyl records. Listening to the original metal box vinyl was a bit of work, something like a 40-minute commitment of changing records. The material was similar to the non-pop parts of first issue. The big single here was Death Disco, which appeared on the album as Swan Lake. Jim Walker had left by this time. He was replaced by not one, but by 3 drummers on various tracks. Of course, the one that sticks out in my own industrial brain was Martin Atkins, who, of course, would later achieve notability in Killing Joke, Ministry, and who would go on to co-found Pigface. Martin was still fairly unknown at this time. He had just come off his Brian Brain project, and he'd only played on one track on this album, which was Bad Baby, which was a nickname of Keith Levine's. Songs on this album were generally unstructured jamming, though. Wobble would come up with a bass line. Keith would scratch away on guitar. The drummer would play a steady beat with occasional fills, and Lydon would do his thing. The one exception was the closer, which was Radio 4, which is an unusual instrumental bit that I'm pretty sure Keith Levine wrote and performed himself. So altogether, this is a landmark post-punk album that a lot of people see as a high point for PIL. But, PIL were a lot of things over the years, and comparing their albums in different eras is like comparing apples and oranges. And this album isn't even my favorite of the early years. That distinction goes to their third studio album, The Flowers of Romance. Now, I picked this up in the 90s, and I had no idea what was on it. But before I talk about this, I want to talk about how I first heard PIL. So I first heard PIL from their late 80s output, which was almost entirely different. The first thing I heard from them was their album 9, which is this album. And I heard it back when it was new in the late 80s. I hadn't even heard the Sex Pistols at this point. I was still heavily into Rush and whatever was on the FM radio at the time. Remember, I wouldn't really get into alternative music until 1990 or so when I was coming out of high school. So yeah, I got my hands on this album and listened to it, and I thought, wow, this is the guy from the Sex Pistols. Like, weren't they really like kind of noisy? And I was impressed that he had such a good voice and a unique voice. But it was the production on this album that really captured me. This album and the one immediately before it, which was called Happy. So Happy and Nine, those two. And I could have sworn I had a copy of Happy, but I guess I don't, or maybe I misplaced it. I can't imagine I would have sold it, so I just don't know where it is. But anyway, Happy was produced by Gary Langan, who, of course, was a co-founder of The Art of Noise. And Nine was produced by Stephen Hague, who is partially to blame for destroying New Order's later output, but nevertheless was viewed in the 80s as being a very slick producer. But yeah, these albums, Happy and Nine, sounded very tight. They were poppy, yet rocky, and somewhat sophisticated. They definitely weren't punk, that's for sure. Of course, by then, PIL was a completely different band, but more on that later. I'm just getting things all mixed up again. So I saw The Flowers of Romance in a bin at a used record shop in the 90s, and I picked it up because it said PIL on it, and also because it looked a bit spooky. There's this picture of this crazy-looking woman on the cover, and if you open it up, it has this weird red font, and, you know, this was very puzzling to me. The whole thing just looked like the poster to a horror movie, and I guess that's what drew me to it. And then I got in my car and I popped this disc in, and I was just blown away. Like I said, I bought this in the 90s, and by then I had heard some pretty crazy stuff. So Einstürzen, Neubauten, Throbbing Gristle, Skinny Puppy. I didn't expect a PIL album to sound so experimental and out there. And in fact, this album didn't really sound like anything else I'd ever heard. Even today, that's true. So what is that sound? Let me try to describe it for you. It's very sparse. The drum kit is for sure the centerpiece, and they somehow achieved this tremendous, huge drum sound. They recorded the album at a studio called The Manor in Oxfordshire. I guess it had a really big concrete room for recording drums. And Martin and Keith shared drumming duties, sometimes playing together. Martin in particular was playing some really unusual beats. They were almost like beats for marches, not always for rock music, but they're still really powerful, and the drum sound is enormous, and they really, really groove. It's also worth pointing out that Wobble had left by this point. So there's very little bass on this album, except maybe on one or two tracks. And I know on one of the tracks, John Lydon was playing a bass with a bow. And it's also strange that Keith Levine played less guitar on this record. Sometimes he was instead playing drums or playing these noisy little synthesizers he had bought. But when he played guitar, it was just thinner and more trebly than ever. Like they were consciously trying to do everything different on this album. So they also had this new producer here, Nick Launay, who they pretty much promoted aggressively from being the tape op to being the real producer. And Nick was game for anything. He was up for trying all sorts of new things. So there's actually a bunch of early sampling on this record. So your analog, old school kind of tape loop sampling. So for instance, they wired up a TV to the mixing board so that moving one of the sliders up and down would mix in whatever was on the TV at that moment into the track. That's how they got some opera music on the album. They also famously recorded Martin's Mickey Mouse wristwatch. They used the ticking as a backing track for Four Enclosed Walls, and they just added a harmonizer to it and made this really strange rhythmic noise. So that was pretty cool. And there are a couple tunes on here that definitely have a Middle Eastern kind of vibe, so it gives it that sort of exotic sort of flavor. And the whole album is pretty spooky. Maybe it's best appreciated at night. My favorite track by far is this thing called Under the House. I mean, think about it. What's under the house? A basement, a concrete slab, the earth's mantle. According to John Lydon, it was about a ghost he saw at the manor, and he tells the story in the lyrics pretty straightforwardly. And this ghost or corpse or whatever he thought he saw, he watched it go under the house, which I don't know, whatever that means to you, but it sounds pretty strange. But damn, this song has maybe the best intro of any song ever. It's sort of this background noise like from the TV, and then this sudden burst of white noise, and then this insane tribal drumming with Keith and Martin playing drums off of each other with that huge, huge sound. And I get such a kick out of it. It's just great. And that's the thing. I find this record so interesting because it sounds different and yet is so powerful. The drums are just huge and in your face. And I read that, the drums were influenced by Peter Gabriel's first couple albums. I guess he had a really big drum sound on his first few solo albums. But then Phil Collins was impressed with the sound of the drums on The Flowers of Romance, and then he ended up reaching out to Nick Launay later to recreate that sound for his own solo records. And we all know how big the drum fill is on In the Air Tonight. I mean, we've all air drummed to that a million times, right? So why else is this album great? It makes me think of how Frank Zappa used to say that he would play Edgar Varese for his friends as a kind of intelligence test. It's if they responded positively to it, he knew that they were on the same wavelength, right? And I could see doing something similar with The Flowers of Romance. It's something that you either get it and love it, or you don't get it at all. And unfortunately, I never really played this album for my friends because by the time I picked it up, we were already past that stage of, hanging out in each other's houses playing music. We were grown-ups. But I imagine there aren't many folks who are lukewarm about this album one way or the other. So yeah, definitely my favorite PIL album. The name of the album came from an early punk band. There were some associates of the Pistols who formed another band called The Flowers of Romance, and they would open for the Pistols and stuff. It was sort of a joke band, and I know Sid Vicious was in it for a while, and so were Jaw Wobble and Keith Levine at times. And the lady on the cover is actually Jeanette Lee, and she was a videographer and was friends with the band and with Don Letts, and she was part of this group of creative folks that hung around the PIL camp. And she was even in PIL for a time, doing what, I don't really know. I'm not sure if she performed on stage or what, but yeah, this is a perfect cover for this music in my mind. It really brings a kind of ceremonial vibe to it and captures some of the music's sort of manic energy. And again, that crazy red font, it just gives it such a B-movie horror vibe. I just love it. It's definitely an interesting listen for sure. So where did they go from here? They would change a lot through the 80s and 90s. Everyone would split, basically, except for John Lydon, who kept the name going. He'd do the next album without Keith Levine, and that would be an album called This Is What You Want, This Is What You Get, which spawned one of their biggest hits in This Is Not a Love Song. And then Martin Atkins would leave John without a band at all. And John's response was to team up with Bill Laswell, who hired a bunch of jazz and rock royalty as session musicians to play on the next album, which was appropriately titled Album. And here you can see that it's called Compact Disc because, cleverly, the title depended on the format, and it was a play on the whole generic product branding thing that was prevalent in the 80s. This album is notable for who played on it. You had folks like Steve Vai, Ginger Baker, Tony Williams, Bernie Worrell. John Lydon claimed that he even recorded Miles Davis, who happened to stop by the studio one day, but strangely enough, they didn't put him on the record, but who knows. All of these tunes were very polished pop. They weren't experimental at all. This album produced a modest hit in Rise, which had a very MTV-friendly video. But after Album, Lydon decided he wanted his own band again, so he put together what would be a fairly stable lineup. He had John McGeough and Lou Edmonds on guitar, and Alan Diaz on bass, and Bruce Smith on drums. And with some changes here and there, this is the band that would represent PIL for the next 30 years. And like I said, the next couple of albums, Happy and Nine, were maybe my next favorite phase of the band, since that's where I really first heard them. It was the first PIL I ever listened to. I owned Nine, and I do own Nine. I think I had it on cassette originally, and I bought the CD. I didn't have Happy for a long time. I think I did have a couple of the songs on a mixtape. I remember Seattle and Rules and Regulations on that tape. And the funny thing is they went right into Tin Omen by Skinny Puppy. To this day, I expect to hear Tin Omen right after hearing Rules and Regulations. And it was a pretty cool transition, I have to say. But honestly, I haven't listened to any of PIL's later albums. I think the first one that I kind of skipped was That What Is Not around 1991 or so. But PIL are still touring, and they still play some of the early stuff. And I have to say, I saw a recent performance of Albatross from Metal Box on YouTube from a recent show here that was actually really jaw-dropping. So yeah, good stuff that they're still doing. Let's talk about John Lydon today. So, punk legend John Lydon. Yeah, but I have to say I'm a bit put off by him these days. And it's not so much for his dangerous bad boy image. I mean, the guy's, retirement age, so how dangerous can he be? But I think he bums me out a bit because of the way he seems to have embraced conservative politics. So in this way, he's sort of become like your pain-in-the-ass uncle at Thanksgiving, watching too much Fox News and talking about QAnon Pizzagate conspiracies instead of passing the freaking sweet potatoes. And this is especially ironic given that we're talking about Johnny Rotten here. So this is the guy who the previous generation had pegged as the Antichrist, poster boy for youth rebellion, the guy who caused a moral panic by cursing on national TV and seemed to enjoy putting a finger in the eye of anyone in authority. And in his time, he was viewed as uncontrollable and playing by no rules but his own. He was the ultimate punk icon, except for maybe Sid Vicious, who is dead at any rate. And as an intelligent guy, John had the advantage of frequently being underestimated. He was quick, clever, charismatic, and he used all of that leverage to stick it to the man. And I would say that punk as a movement was hugely subversive. The whole idea was to challenge authority, right? To have ordinary people reclaim power from the chosen few. Ordinary people could do it for themselves, whatever it was. You didn't have to be one of the anointed. And that was the point of the whole DIY ethic. It was like a egalitarian ideal. You're doing it, whatever it is just as valid as me doing it or that guy over there doing it. Even if I'm rich and successful, there's really nothing special about me. You can do it too. So that's the general idea. And there's something inherently progressive about that attitude. It's the opposite of conservative. Just going by the definition of the words, right? Conservatism seeks to maintain a power structure, to keep the status quo, or even to roll the clock back. It's trying to concentrate power in the few, and it inherently believes that some people are better than others. So Lydon himself even made this point with his memoir, which was titled Rotten, No Irish, No Blacks, No Dogs. And the title comes from a sign that appeared in a window in his youth. And it's a reminder that all of us can be outsiders to those in power. It's not just black and white. They can draw that line wherever they want to draw that line. Who's in and who's out, right? And back in the day, the Irish were considered outsiders, which is hard to believe these days. But in my grandparents' days, Italians weren't considered white, And in my parents' day, not that long ago, Catholics were considered outsiders. So if you think you're in today, don't count on being in forever, because that line is constantly changing, and it's the old story, folks, of the lady who voted for the face-eating leopard party when she later complained that the leopards ate her face too. I didn't think they'd eat my face. I mean, how stupid do you have to be? Get a clue, right? So progressive movements want to overturn that power structure, and that's why they're progressive. They're making progress over what came before. And that's also why they're subversive, because they question authority. And I've always had a subversive streak. You know, I'm attracted to art that challenges authority, and like John Lennon's Imagine, for instance, which might be the most subversive punk song of all. You have to really read the lyrics, folks, and to see what he did there. I think it went over a lot of people's heads. But in fact, that's not only a trait of punk, but subversion is a trait of rock and roll itself. You know, rock and roll being a superset that includes punk and much else. And if you don't think rock and roll is subversive, go ask your grandparents how the world reacted when Elvis started shaking his hips on TV. I guarantee they'll tell you that Elvis challenged authority. And the Beatles challenged authority too, writing songs about pot and saying they were bigger than Jesus. And so did Chuck Berry challenge authority. And so did Little Richard challenge authority his whole life. So, you know, rock and roll had its roots in youth culture, and it's in the nature of youth to want to rebel against their parents and against the older generations. Generation Z is doing that right now, and that's the whole point in saying, okay, boomer. I mean, that's really annoying and disrespectful to older people, but that's kind of the point. And that's also kind of the point of rock and roll, and it's a healthy and normal thing. So what's sad is when people get older and cling to their ways, the old ways. And that's why I think so many folks bend hard right as they get old. Well, that and being poisoned by Fox News and malignant tribalism. But these folks literally think that the kids are crazy and that everyone younger than them is stupid and wrong. And you get that, back in my day, no one talked about gays and it was great kind of bullshit. So they go conservative to literally conserve their outdated values, and they do it out of fear that the world is passing them by. Well, guess what, Gramps? The world will pass you by eventually, and there's nothing you can do about it. It passes all of us by sooner or later, and fighting that change does nothing more than make you look like a pathetic old dickhead. So to see a guy like John Lydon, Johnny Rotten himself, taking that sort of right turn is kind of sad. I mean, rooting for an obvious moron like Trump, and a fascist moron at that, is about as opposite of punk and rock and roll as you can get. It's like rooting for your grandparents' music. Like, I love Lawrence Welk. I love Pat Boone. You know, it's as conservative or as reactionary as you can get, and is not only uncool, but is frankly embarrassing. Now, I realize that it would be completely on brand for Lydon to say a bunch of crap just because it's provocative. He's so unhinged and unexpected. He's got no filter, lol. But I don't think he's doing that here. I think he means it. And what does that tell us? Maybe nothing more than this, that all of our old heroes are ultimately flawed human beings, and we shouldn't put anyone on a pedestal because they'll only let us down sooner or later. And for myself, I choose to focus instead on his contributions that really were progressive and subversive back in the day, that really changed the world for the better, and not on the garbage that's coming out of his mouth now that he's a senior citizen. By the way, this book is actually pretty good. It came out in 1994, well before Lydon became a right-wing nutter, and it focuses on the Pistols. He said he'd write a follow-up about PIL, but to my knowledge, he hasn't done that yet. So where are they now? I was bummed to hear that Keith Levine died last November 2022. He was just 65 years old, folks. John McGeoch died even younger when he was 48 in 2004, which was just tragic. Such a great guitarist. Alan Diaz, fortunately, is still alive, but he left the band in 1992, and interesting enough, he switched careers and became a long-distance runner. I don't know, I find that really freaking impressive. But today, the band is Lydon with Lou Edmonds still on guitar, and he plays a lot of other stringed instruments, just a really talented guy. Bruce, I don't know why I cannot say his name. Bruce Smith is still on drums. Awesome drummer. And then we have relative newcomer Scott Firth on bass. And these four guys are really tight as a band, and they really do put on a great show. Check them out online or even live if you can. So yeah, that's PIL, folks. And my favorite album of theirs, as I said, is The Flowers of Romance, one of the strangest albums in my collection. Still one of my favorites for its amazing drum sound, its raw power, and its sheer spookiness, and for how unique it is. I'm really curious. Let me know what you think of it. And let me know if you've ever heard another band make music that sounds like this. Like, what's the closest thing you can compare it to? I really can't think anything. And also, are there any other truly unique albums that stand out to you? Ones that just don't sound like anything else? I mean, music today is so formulaic. I'm curious what these things are. If you think of anything, let me know. Let me know. Put it in the comments, please. So yeah, this is Stronger Than Reason, signing off for another night, but we'll be back soon with some other stuff to talk about. Please leave a comment, and please subscribe if you like to hear a 50-something Gen Xer try to temporarily ignore the horrors in the world by hyper-focusing on comforting music from 30, 40 years ago, because we're all in this together, folks, after all. If you listen this far, or at all, I thank you, and until next time, stay strong.